Hawkeye 360. I'm going to ask Henry to get us kicked off with a discussion about Smallsat licensing issues, and then I'll go ahead and introduce the other speakers. Henry has been involved in a number of different aspects of the industry, representing both established players as well as new entrants into the industry, dealing with satellite and earth station regulation before the FCC and NOAA, is a wealth of experience as it relates to spectrum and various licensing issues. So Henry, let me turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Tom, and happy to be here today on this panel, and thanks everybody for joining. So, you know, we're here to talk about Smallsats, and it's good timing that the FCC, through the Federal Register, the Smallsat order that came out last summer on August 1st, 2019, was finally published last week, and it will be effective on August 19th, 2020. So, you know, it's been a year now, so maybe a nice refresher on what those rules mean once they're effective would be helpful. So I thought that's what I would start with today. For Smallsat operators, the FCC certainly hopes that the rules are worth the wait. There has been one operator, R2 at least, that filed for a waiver of the rules to seek to be under the Smallsat regime early. But hearing from Tom Sullivan and others, they're eager to see industry's reaction now that the Smallsat rules will take effect later this month. The reason behind the Smallsat rules was to create a new streamlined application process. And the big drive here was to get Smallsat applications under the Part 25 commercial licensing regime rather than the Part 5 experimental licensing rules. Those rules are administered by the Office of Engineering and Technology, and those folks have a wealth of knowledge on many, many topics, but the real satellite expertise lies with the International Bureau at the FCC, and they're the ones who administer Part 25. So the drive was to encourage Smallsat operators to apply under Part 25 rather than Part 5. At a high level, the Smallsat rules, which are optional, have lower application fees. They're exempt from processing round procedures. They promise a faster application processing time, and they ease the bond requirements, among others. I'll get into some more detail here in my brief overview. Again, it's an optional process for Smallsat operators. They're still able to file under Part 5 or other Part 25 rules for authorization. And so it means that it adds to, rather than replacing, existing authorization processes for satellites. It's available for both those seeking U.S. licenses and those foreign licensees who are seeking market access to the U.S. market. It's an important point. The FCC also laid out what it means to be a Smallsat operator under the streamlined rules, and they kind of ticked off a list of categories, and I'll go through them now. You have to have 10 or fewer satellites under a single authorization, but one entity can get more than one authorization. So if you have a Smallsat constellation of 17 satellites, that means you're going to get 2 licenses from the FCC if you seek to go under this regime. It has to be a 6-year or less total in-orbit satellite lifetime. This was based on FCC research and comments it received based on the typical life cycle for Smallsats. So in conjunction with that, the license terms are 6 years, and that's calculated from the time when the first satellite is placed in its authorized orbit and it begins operating. Now, unlike traditional Part 25 licenses where constellations can be replaced, where satellites can be replaced and constellations replenished, and the same call sign will carry on over time, original satellites here are not eligible for replacement in order to extend the license term, unless it's due to circumstances outside the licensee's control. So that's an important point. They did give the maximum wet mass of 180 kilograms The satellites must have propulsion capabilities or be deployed below 600 kilometers in altitude. These satellites have to have the ability to share the use of frequency bands with current operators without also what they say, quote, materially constraining future satellite entrants, unquote, seeking to use the band. And they seek, they spelled out what I will call a relatively low risk from an orbital debris perspective. So again, applicants under the streamlined process, not subject to processing round procedures or default service rules. Instead, applicants have to certify that its operations of its satellites will not interfere with those of existing operators, certify that they will not, again, materially constrain future operators from using the frequency bands, and provide a brief narrative that supports those conclusions. Importantly, Smallsats will operate on a non-interference basis relative to regularly authorized Part 25 satellites that operate in the same service. Here's the big point that was meant to encourage satellite, Smallsat operators to go to Part 25. It's the $30,000 application fee. This is way, way lower than traditional application fees for Part 25 licensees. This applies importantly to both U.S. licensees and market access grantees. The FCC has also promised a new regulatory fee category, and this perhaps or even likely will be addressed in next year's regulatory fee order. This, of course, comes hot on the heels of the FCC extending regulatory fees to market access grantees this past year, and boosting the annual payment for NGSOs. So I think Smallsat operators are eagerly anticipating what that regulatory fee category will be and what the regulatory fee payment will be. The Commission declined to adopt any new limitation on or lists of available frequencies for Smallsat operators. That was encouraged by some commenters. They didn't go down that path. And instead are going to consider frequency requests on a case-by-case basis, subject to the same analysis that they give to other Part 25 applicants who are not Smallsat operators. The Commission does anticipate, though, that applications for Smallsat systems under the streamlined process will generally be limited to the bands where there is currently an allocation for satellite services under the U.S. table of frequency allocations and in the international table of frequency allocations. Requests for other bands, of course, would be subject to waiver and an accompanying justification. And again, if those waivers were granted, the systems will be authorized on a non-interference basis. So that's a big picture overview of the Smallsat rules, and it's an exciting time for Smallsats to have this streamlined regime. You know, a year-long wait for these rules, longer if they were seeking to have these rules come into effect earlier. That was that spurred on that rulemaking. So again, they take effect later this month, and the FCC does anticipate seeing a flurry of applications after that. So we'll see. Tom, I'll kick it back over to you.
Great, thanks, Henry. I should have noted that the Wiley firm is general counsel for SIA, and the proceeding Henry was covering was one of our great priorities for the last year. So we were delighted to see the changes that were made in the rules, certainly simplifying the process and greatly reducing the cost for a number of our members. Our next speaker is going to be Nathan Johnson. I mentioned his role with Planet, and he comes to the company with experience on the Hill, where he had been on the House Science, Space, and Technology Committee, and he also had been at the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation, so brings a wealth of experience. And he's going to talk about remote sensing reform, as well as orbital debris in the Smallsat licensing regime. Nathan, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Yeah, so I'm pleased to be invited to speak here today. I'm also co-chair of SIA's Earth Observation Forum, and most of what I'm going to talk about you can find in both SIA's and Planet's own filings before the FCC proceedings. and reactions to the new NOAA regulations. But I'm really going to be continuing the theme that Henry was talking about, which was substantial regulatory reform in US agencies over small sats, and of course, in particular for me, over Earth observation small sats. I see that we have a few attendees from NOAA, so thankfully I only have good things to say about the new NOAA regulations. They've been in the works for almost 2 years now, and the final results are regulations that are streamlined, forward-looking, and they really represent a philosophical shift in striking a balance between US technological innovation and competition from foreign actors and national security concerns. So again, these are just for commercial remote sensing satellites, but the regulations introduced a tiered system based on what is commercially available internationally and in the US that's offering substantially the same unenhanced imaging capability as a US operator. What they're really comparing US operators against is data that can be obtained or purchased commercially. And they're also taking into account where foreign operators are restricted by their foreign governments as well. So I'll break it down. The Tier 1 license for a commercial remote sensing operator in the US is really the least restrictive tier. And it's least restricted because NOAA has determined that that US operator's capability is already available from a foreign provider. And this is, again, the balance between US innovation and competition abroad. There's no reason in NOAA's mind to hold back a US operator for security concerns if that capability is already out there in the world and people could already get it from another provider. Tier 2 is slightly more restricted. Tier 2 is described as when a US operator's capability is only available from other US providers. And this doesn't mean that NOAA rushes in with all sorts of new restrictions. It just means that for Tier 2 operators, they may have to abide by limited operation directives. Limited operations directives is sort of colloquially, correct me if I'm wrong, but another way of saying shutter control. So for a Tier 2 capability, if NOAA determined that imaging a certain location or during a certain time should be prohibited for national security reasons, they could go in and ask all the US providers of that tier capability to stop taking that imagery or stop distributing that imagery for a limited time. And again, this is the balance. If all US operators or multiple US operators have this ability, then there's only so much that NOAA can do to limit it. And so that's where a limited operation directive would come in. And then the final tier is a Tier 3, where the US operator's capability is unique or novel. Commercially, it's not available anywhere else in the world, in which case NOAA does have a substantial interest in being able to regulate that technology, again, for national security concerns and reasons. The only thing Tier 3 has, and this follows the sort of temporary review theme of the new regulations, are temporary license conditions. These temporary license conditions only last from 1 to 3 years. There's a periodic review of it to extend them another year. And this means that even if a US company develops a new capability, NOAA is not going to hold that back forever. We recognize that the industry is developing, new technologies are coming online across the world, and so it only makes sense to temporarily limit these capabilities and then see what emerges internationally. I should also mention that all these tiers include a reduced regulatory burden. Beforehand, NOAA had quarterly reports and annual reports that were required, and now that's replaced with a single annual certification, saying that nothing has changed, no material facts have changed on which the license was based. And this, again, keeps US companies competitive on the global market. NOAA, has recognized that space policy directives have asked for a reduced regulatory burden, and that's what these regulations deliver. It doesn't limit NOAA's ability to inspect and ensure compliance with the rules. And so I think this is a big positive for everybody involved. And I just want to say a lot of the reforms that we have seen, yes, are are a trend in the US government. You see them in Space Policy Directive 2, requiring reduced regulatory burden. And you see it in other aspects as well. Congress introduced an amendment to the NDAA requiring the National Reconnaissance Office to consider commercial capabilities when they are evaluating their imaging needs. So again, overall, the US government is really focused on competitiveness of US providers and companies. The other aspect I wanted to talk about, back to the FCC, there is an orbital debris proceeding going on right now. There was a notice in rule and order, back in April, and SIA, on behalf of a number of their companies, submitted some comments. And what we've seen now is the FCC doing a further notice of proposed rulemaking. They are listening to the concerns of the industry in the US and are taking more time to evaluate some of their proposals. One among the list of things that the FCC is further evaluating for orbital debris includes probability of accidental explosions, collision risk for multi-satellite systems, maneuverability requirements, casualty risk, indemnification, and performance bonds tied to successful spacecraft disposal. SIA had a number of comments on these originally, and as an association and as Planet, we really appreciate the FCC's effort to address these concerns with their earlier draft. I know that SIA looks forward to continued engagement. It's a great industry association with the FCC on these topics. And one of the other big things that we've urged the FCC to do is to engage in an interagency process to develop an integrated approach for orbital debris risk management. Because we do have multiple agencies that are involved, that have input, that have their own standards. And in order to reduce the regulatory burden, we'd like to see multiple agencies being able to work together to come to a consensus. And the FCC has been taking input from other agencies, and other agencies have shown interest in this as well, including the Office of Space Commerce. So just to quickly run down some of the concerns that were raised, the FCC orbital debris proposal included the phrase case by case a number of times. And we thought that this maybe reduced the transparency and the objective standards for judging what systems would be able to comply with orbital debris rules, or what systems or efforts might be. We also saw that there were compliance rules more aggressive than other agencies, sometimes diverging from the risk standards used by NASA. And we also saw for large NGSO constellations, medium to large, the risk assessments were applied to the entire constellation instead of being left to a satellite by satellite basis. So this sort of compounded the risk over an entire constellation, making it much more difficult to reach the same standard. We also saw that the indemnification proposal from the FCC had no statutory authority to cite to. It was sort of unclear and vague, and we urged the Commission to fully evaluate the implications of imposing a blanket and open-ended indemnification provision. And then we also saw that maneuverability was an issue. Maneuverability was required for satellites above 400 kilometers, but the way it was written in the draft proposal implied that differential drag would be impermissible, wouldn't meet that standard. And this would eliminate 3U cube satellites because there was no viable propulsion system that could fit on a 3U CubeSat. Also, the time period for meeting these maneuverability requirements was originally 2 years, and design changes like that require more than 2 years and would end up impeding these business plans and even some US government obligations, because we do service US government contracts and we have certain obligations to those government customers. So those were just some of the issues that came up in the FCC proceeding. But again, the FCC is further evaluating them. They take input, they take meetings, and I think it is a positive collaborative effort with them. So for Smallsats and for Earth observation, there is a lot of active regulatory reform going on, and a lot of it seems to be in a very positive direction.
Thank you, Nathan, and thank you for your service and leadership as co-chair of our Earth Observation Forum. We have the good fortune of having our other co-chair as our next speaker. Mike Monero, I mentioned, is with Hawkeye 360. He also brings a wealth of experience to his position. He has served as senior counsel for the House Committee on Science and Technology. He was a senior policy analyst at the National Space Council, where he was the liaison to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as serving at NOAA. Mike is going to talk about some of the policy issues before Congress, especially as those relating to the Defense Department. Hawkeye 360 does a lot of work with the defense community. And then he's also going to discuss launch issues. Mike, over to you.
Thank you, Tom. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. I'm going to approach this maybe a little bit differently than you typically see. I really want to empower people on the line to have a way of thinking, a way of taxonomizing, a way of structuring their own analysis, their own considerations as members of our community. So the first thing I would reflect upon is why we're here and why we call ourselves a Smallsat community and why that's relevant from a policy and political leadership perspective. And I think what you'll find is that there's a lot of goodness, there's a lot of value that's come out over the past decade through the innovations that have allowed new entrants, be them launch, be them manufacturing, be them commercial operators of data from space like Hawkeye, that ultimately brings something of value. And what I found over my years of experience is that while it is useful for the community to self-organize and to self-identify as Smallsat, it's also useful to recognize that typically policy decisions are made not because something is a Smallsat associated part of the community, but that's a means to an end. And that end is some sort of value proposition. And a healthy way to think about this is that if something's in the U.S. national interest, if something enhances U.S. national power, and if what a member of our community is bringing to the table helps that end state, that's really where the rubber hits the road typically on the highest level of consideration for political leadership, for thought leadership, for policy leadership. So when you take that into account, the other thing I wanted to empower you is to have a longer lens about decisions and legislation and debate on Capitol Hill. I think if you got in a time machine and you really looked over the arc of commercial space, going all the way back to the 1960s with the first telecommunication satellites, into the 80s, with which at the time there was a lot of hope about the launch industry and the Earth observation remote sensing industry, legislative reforms in the 90s focusing on remote sensing, and then some of the innovative legislation that was supporting industrial-based activity in the 2000s, and where we are today. I think what you'll see on that arc is that this is not a partisan issue. Right? That both sides of the aisle recognize it's good for our country to lead in commercial space. It's good for our country, right, to have small sat operators or a multiplicity of launch vehicles, however you want to contextualize it. But that being said, it's never an end in and of itself. It's a means to an end. It's a means to an end. Now, if you want to think tactically about what's been going on in the Hill this cycle, I think at a relatively high level, you see consistency with the bipartisan support for commercial space. I think when you drill down into the subcomponents of what we call the small sat industrial base, you'll have differing opinions on the launch side about whether or not the Hill's doing the right thing versus on the remote sensing side versus on the acquisition side. I also think it's helpful when you think about things to recognize that where you sit in the small sat community also informs what you advocate for with the Hill and who the Hill is interacting with. So a good example is that you can have government-operated, government-owned systems that might fall into what we call a small sat bus, but at the same time, you can have providers like a Hawkeye who are operating relatively small satellites who are doing something different from a business model perspective. For example, Hawkeye, we have private capital, we've raised private capital, we put our own infrastructure on orbit, and we've absorbed that risk for the taxpayer, and we're providing the government a commercial product delivered, a commercial service delivered, which is a different business model. Do we happen to have smaller satellites? Yes. Are the smaller satellites a means to an end? Yes, they're not the end in and of themselves. So I think that's just healthy, because in our community, I've heard some confusion in the way people think through things. They sometimes get that part backwards. A few other things about the Hill that you've seen in the press. There seems to be strong bipartisan support to make sure that commercial generally has a seat at the table. One of the things I was impressed with was an amendment Senator Cruz supported that passed the Senate in the National Defense Authorization Act recently, that directed ODNI and the DoD to make sure that when they plan their future overhead architectures, that commercial has a seat at the table, and when reasonable, commercial is used. And the underlying policy rationale for that, once again, and I'm like a broken record, is it's in our national interest to leverage the value proposition that commercial U.S. industrial base is offering, including commercial offerings, including Smallsat or Smallsat associated offerings. The other thing I wanted to highlight is not on the Hill, but has to do with the FAA and regulation. We've had some great speakers already highlight things, but no one has yet spoken about the FAA NPRM that came out on the update of their launch vehicle regulations. For the Smallsat launch vehicle operators, I'm sure they're well aware of that, but I think for the folks who don't operate launch vehicles, they should also be tracking that. Hawkeye is a member of the Commercial Smallsat Spectrum Management Association, and the CSSMA filed into the proceedings for that regulatory action a recommendation that the payload review is modified to have fixed timelines when it's independent. I just want to explain that briefly. So the way it is right now, if a launch provider files a launch license and you have a satellite, you can go on that launch license to have the payload review completed and then approved for launch. Typically, it's L-60 to 90. But there's another option, and the other option is you file your satellite payload review independently of that launch license. And what the CSSMA said is, look, that actually can be a very useful tool, not only for the industry who wants to get ahead of the filing, but also for the government who gets overwhelmed at the last minute, particularly as you see these large launches with many, many different satellites, right? If you've got 50, 60, 70 different payloads going up on the same launch, it's a lot of paperwork at the last minute. So why don't you provide some regulatory certainty to the people filing outside of the launch license and give them a fixed timeline that would be the same as if they were on a launch license? I just want to highlight that for you. I think that's a good recommendation. I concur with CSSMA's position, and we're waiting to see what the final rule will say, hopefully around October of this year. I'll leave the rest to questions as it relates to Congress or otherwise.
Thank you, Mike. So as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question, please use the chat function. It should be at the bottom of your screen. I've got a few questions that I want to run through, but we encourage all of you to ask your questions since we have such a great lineup of speakers, participants on our panel today. Let me start with a question about what policies the administration could take to further advance the interests of the small sat community. We've certainly seen a variety of steps taken with space policy directives, some of the activities of the FCC, but what could be done to further enhance the prospects of the industry from a policy perspective? And let me just run through the order, the reverse order. Let me start with Mike, and then we'll go to Nathan and Henry. Just any suggestions that you have.
Thank you, Tom. So this suggestion is not for this administration only, it's for any administration, now or in the future. And that recommendation is at the highest level to make sure that the government, the US government, is promoting policies, regulation, legislation, the whole 9 yards to ensure that the US commercial industrial base, including the small sat industrial base, has a competitive playing field with its international competitors. Right? One of the amazing things about our country, and I love this country, and it's amazing, is how much freedom we have to innovate, to collaborate, to pull capital, to create new ideas. And that's one of the great strengths of our country. It really is. And when you look at peer competitors overseas, that's not necessarily their strength. Their strength may lie in directed industrial base activity. But while the US is very good at innovating and being a first mover in some instances in commercial space, that doesn't mean we can keep that ground if the rules governing who we can market to, how we engage internationally aren't fair. If a foreign competitor and their foreign government does things that undermine that fair, competitive market environment. So I would put that #1 on any administration. I think this administration, with the Office of Space Commerce, is aware of that, and there's various folks in the administration, including a crew of bureaucrats, who have in the past and continue to fight for U.S. industry having a fair foot internationally. And I applaud them for that. And I hope that that attitude and that perspective continues into the future.
Thanks, Mike. Nathan?
Yeah, I would generally agree with Mike about allowing U.S. industry to be competitive internationally. I think that's what we've seen with the new NOAA regulations, is tying any limitations on U.S. providers to what is already available internationally. And, furthering Mike's point about the freedom that we enjoy in the United States, it also includes being able to talk to regulators and legislature and executive branch. So I think the collaboration, the listening that we've seen from the FCC and other government agencies, I just want to see that continue and going on. So I think furthering the current processes of this administration and even previous administrations to continue that industry government collaboration is a good thing.
Great. Henry?
Yeah, one of the things that I'll be looking at in the next couple of years is that spectrum policy as it relates to satellite operators. The recent C-band proceeding, it was long, it was protracted, it was contentious at points, but in the end, if you take a high-level view, it was satellite operators coming forward with a creative solution to a problem of getting more spectrum available for 5G. And in the end, they were very practical-minded, and the solution was ultimately adopted by the FCC. So the question going forward is, are there opportunities to do that in other bands? Will the FCC seek to be proactive with satellite operators, and also satellite operators knowing that they might have to protect their turf with spectrum in other bands? That's one thing to look forward to. And with regards to NOAA, I give them a lot of credit for the rules they put out, but what I'll be looking for going forward is the implementation. And I think there are a lot of questions about the rules, about how they will be implemented with regard to specific operators, and I think that's sort of a wait and see as we go forward. So.
Can I piggyback on what Henry just said as well? It's a really good observation, Henry. And I would also say, first, I want to applaud the FCC and NTIA. Every engagement I've had with them has been professional and productive, and they're really trying to do the right thing for at least the operators, from my perspective. That being said, other countries have dedicated spectrum bands, everything from S-band to X-band, or what we would call, like commercial Earth observation, right? Or is commonly leveraged in the United States FCC parlance as EESS bands. So I think it's relevant, and this piggybacks on what Henry was saying, is we should really look at that and see, if in the future there will be many, 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 many more satellites that are commercially operated in these different spectrum bands that right now don't have dedicated non-federal bands. That's just something that should be studied and discussed and assessed as a possibility.
Thank you. So, Mike and Nathan, I know that you operate globally. Henry, you represent companies that are international as well. Are there any policies that you've seen in other countries that are pro-satellite, pro-small satellite that you think could be adopted in the United States? Henry, let me start with you.
This sort of gets back to what we were talking about earlier. We mentioned the new regulatory fee regime that's going to attach for market access grantees. And, a lot of countries don't have similar rules for satellites that are downlinking into their countries. And it's going to be interesting to see if there's sort of a tit for tat internationally because of that. And you know, as a sort of aside to that, you've seen some companies come in with the FCC and sort of poke away at the edges of the new regulatory fee regime for market access grantees. For instance, should they apply to those who don't actually provide service in the United States? If the data is really immediately exiting the United States, should that be subject to regulatory fees? So it's one aspect where I understand totally where the FCC is coming from, because the regulatory fees are really based upon how much their staff is spending on, how much time they're spending on these applications and day-to-day work for market access grantees. But I am interested to see the effect globally if other countries do the same with the United States. It will affect competitiveness, and it's sort of a wait and see. And I think the FCC has been open about that, and you know that they want to wait and see what happens, and they'll react accordingly.
Great, thanks, Nathan.
Yeah, so you know, at the end of May, Planet, along with the CSSMA, Commercial Smallsat Spectrum Management Association, filed comments in New Zealand for one of their S-band consultations. And one of the issues that we pushed was global harmonization of certain bands for satellite users around the world. And so it's not a super specific thing I'd like to see in the US, but I would want to make sure that the US maintains the same sort of globally recognized bands for operating small sats around the world, the same interference parameters, allowing small sat ground stations to operate without interference, because we are seeing new entrants, more users of certain spectrum, and we just want to make sure that global operations, because we don't just have ground stations in one country, we want our satellites to be able to use the same frequency at whatever ground station they're downlinking to. We want to make sure that that sort of spectrum policy is considered on a global scale.
Great, thank you, Mike.
Nothing to add on this one, Tom. I'm going to pass.
Okay. Let me turn now to procurement issues. So I have the opportunity to speak at a number of conferences around the country, and something that comes up frequently is how can small companies generally, not just small sat companies, but engage with government agencies in procurement, knowing that there are certainly a lot of challenges to the whole process that the government has in place generally with respect to procurement. I'd like to get your thoughts, especially as I know both Nathan and Mike's companies have worked with the government before. But let me start with Mike. Any recommendations that you have?
First, an observation, and then maybe we can discuss about it. First observation is I do want to applaud the folks that I've worked with through my company with the government. There's a lot of leadership with the various customers that we work with. There's a lot of people who understand what their mission needs are and are assessing various solutions for that. And I think we need to recognize that. Director Scalise at the NRO gave a speech yesterday and talked specifically about this. So we have good leadership in the government who recognize the value proposition of some of the new emergent commercial opportunities such as Hawkeye. I think when you think about recommendations, I would actually start more fundamental. One of the things I would think about for companies that are new or starting or in earlier stages of growth is make sure that when you're developing your company and you're developing your technology and you're developing and assessing your market, that you also have a seat at the table in that due diligence process for legal, regulatory, and policy risk and opportunities. And I think if a company is looking at the U.S. government as a customer, they just have to go in honestly and open-eyed and recognize that the federal procurement process is a multi-year process. And I think for folks who come from outside the government, who are entering the commercial sector in space and have never really been exposed to that before, they're sometimes caught off guard about the timelines and how that works, and some of the complexities associated with the process of a government customer developing a budget proposal, and that proposal being sent to the White House and then being sent to Congress, and then Congress considering it and all those other things. So that would be my main piece of advice for the community.
Nathan, any suggestions?
Unfortunately, I don't think I'm the best person to answer this question, but we have a wonderful Planet Federal team in DC that works directly with the government, and they would probably be a better person to speak to.
Great. Henry?
Get a really good law firm with a government contracts practice. That's what I would say. Yeah, federal procurement is not really my bailiwick. There are great firms in town like Wiley that have government contract specialists for this, but I don't really have much to add.
So I should note while we're on this topic that SIA has a number of roundtable discussions for our members with policymakers, commissioners from the FCC, members of Congress, and next week we actually have one with Claire Grayson, who's responsible for Defense Department procurement issues, to provide an opportunity for members to ask these kinds of questions and to learn about how the processes work. I also saw that we have a question from one of our participants asking whether companies who are located outside the United States can join SIA. And the answer is yes. We just like to make sure that you have an interest in the U.S. Our focus is on the United States, but we have multiple tiers of membership to encourage membership from a variety of companies and locations. I don't want to make this an advertisement, that just both of those things tied in with some of the topics that we're covering. And one of the things that I wanted to talk about is the impact of COVID-19 on funding issues, workforce issues, and supply chain issues. SIA puts together a State of the Satellite Industry report every year, and we actually included a special section as it related to the impact of COVID-19 on the industry. So we've seen some of the impacts on different sectors. We've also seen how our members have stepped up and continue to provide service, especially broadband services, to many of those who are not able to continue to work in an office or access broadband at schools. And we've continued to promote that with policymakers in the United States. But let me ask each of our panelists if there are any policies that they think that could further help the small sat industry weather some of the impacts of COVID. Mike, let me start with you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm actually going to approach this a little different than the industry needs help with COVID. I'd actually like just to highlight what seems to be a positive impact of this whole COVID situation. And, maybe I'm a half glass full type of guy. But one of the things that I've observed is an increasing recognition of the utility of unclassified space-based remote sensing data. And maybe Nathan can speak to this as well, but the COVID put a lot of challenges on government customers to operate remotely outside of some of their traditional settings. And I think it's helped the commercial remote sensing satellite industry because it's allowed us to demonstrate to new people who maybe wouldn't have experienced this before, because now they're working at home remotely, they don't have access to the classified networks, so they're not in SCIF all the time, what an unclassified, for our example, RF geolocation can do to empower insights and make the world a safer place. So I don't want to be a Debbie Downer. Actually, I think there's something good that's coming out of this right now for our industry.
Mike, thank you. And it's interesting because both Hawkeye 360 and Planet have provided us with use cases that we've been able to highlight with policymakers on how the satellite industry has been able to play an important role during this period. Nathan, let me turn to you and ask whether you have any suggestions.
Again, I can't really speak to how small sat operators and companies can support themselves through this period, but sort of to Mike's point, Planet has spoken about how satellite remote imagery has been able to help governments around the world sort of keep track of effects of COVID-19 on their population. Our Chief Strategy Officer, Robbie Shingler, was on a webinar last month called Satellites and Public Health. Again, to Mike's point, the satellite imagery is helpful to people in governments during this time, as well as other small satellite operations that can help provide communications infrastructure as well.
Thanks, Nathan. So, Henry, you and I had a chance to chat about this issue on a podcast recently, and I talked about some of the same things that I mentioned, some of the impacts on the satellite industry. Have you talked to others who may have recommendations, other clients of yours who may have recommendations?
Yeah, I think, I have clients who are not just satellite clients, but, broadcast clients and telecom clients too. And I think they've been generally encouraged with the way the FCC has been open to waivers and deferrals of fees and, deferrals of ministerial rules at a time when workforces are strained, when people like me and Mike and Nathan and everyone else is working in not our office. I don't normally have a Peloton in my office at Wiley, so it's not a common thing in the background there. So it's about flexibility, and I think so far it's just making your voice heard at the regulator, whether it's the FCC or elsewhere, and seeking some relief. And I think generally the FCC has been great about it so far. Chairman Pai has been vocal about being flexible for industry so far. And, it's just about making the voice heard and making sure that continues as the pandemic carries on.
Great, thank you. Let me turn now to Therese Jones with SIA. She's been monitoring the questions that we've gotten via chat and any that may have come in from YouTube. I've got a few more questions to ask, but I just want to make sure that we're able to cover anything that has come up via chat or YouTube. Therese?
I don't think we have any from YouTube yet, but in the chat, we have someone who wants to know what opportunities and programs you recommend a grad student apply to if they want to pursue a career in space policy.
Yeah, I'm really interested in hearing recommendations from each of our members. In normal years, SIA has an event during the summer for interns in the industry, and we have our member companies come in and talk about opportunities within the industry and how to approach their company for full-time positions or for internships. Unfortunately, this year is going to be a virtual event, but it's certainly something important because companies are interested in continuing to make sure that they have access to great talent and ensuring there's opportunities for people who are interested. Let me start with Nathan. Any suggestions that you may have?
Just speaking on a personal basis, not on behalf of Planet, the SGAC, Space Generation Advisory Council, is a great place for young professionals to try and get involved, primarily remotely, and even some of their in-person events have been successfully transitioned to virtual events as well. That's a global organization, so people can join from wherever they are. And the in-person events that I've attended with the SGAC, including the Fusion Forum that's typically held at the Space Symposium, have been great events, great people to meet, and people that I continue to speak to as my career develops further.
Thanks, Nathan. Mike?
Yeah, well, let me just extend an invitation. If there's any students listening or anyone interested in going to get higher education, just send a message to Therese at SIA, and she can introduce you to me over email. I've helped mentor a fair amount of people. They've asked a lot of questions like this, and there's never an exact answer you can give. It helps to understand who the person is, what their background is, what they want to achieve. Do they want to work in the government? Do they want to work in the private sector? Do they have an engineering background? Do they want to be engineers? Do they want to go 100% policy? Are they lawyers, et cetera? So I'm available to help people, so feel free to reach out.
Great. And Henry?
Yeah, from a legal perspective, there's a lot of good resources. There's the Federal Communications Bar Association, which holds many events, some of which are space and satellite related, which are great learning opportunities. The FCC has a great internship program with internships available in the International Bureau and elsewhere. And if you're in law school or thinking about going to law school and you think you're interested in space and space policy, definitely take a space law class if it's available. If it's not available, then perhaps a communications law class, just to kind of get your feet wet and learn some of the basic policy issues that affect satellite operators.
If I could jump in on that one, if we're going to open up law school class recommendations, if there's any sort of legislative analysis or administrative law in particular, as well as export control. Export control, 2-credit class in the evenings even is a great way to make sure that you have an option to get in the door of the satellite and space industry.
Great point, Nathan. So let me ask one of the questions that we've gotten via chat, which is we focused a little bit on satellite on-orbit regs and policy, but what about the ground support infrastructure on foreign soil and at higher latitudes? Also topics like STM and SSA blind spots at higher latitudes. Start with Henry. So.
You know, it's an interesting question. You know, the U.S., as far as jurisdiction, there are questions there about how far the FCC can take its jurisdiction, but there's also legitimate concerns from NASA and others about coordinating the use of spectrum worldwide, not just in the U.S. There are a lot of government Earth stations located throughout the world, and I know that as just part of the IRAC process or other processes that NASA and others on the NTIA side do have a vested interest in ensuring compatibility with commercial systems. It's a little bit of a black box, to be honest with you, but hopefully more transparency will come in the future. And yeah, I think it's a developing area that I think commercial operators should definitely be paying attention to and be aware of as they enter the space, particularly in the bands that Mike and Nathan and their companies use. Those are very coordinated bands and have to go through a lot of processes with NTIA and others.
Great, thank you. Nathan?
No comment.
Okay, Mike?
Likewise, I'll pass on this one, Tom.
Okay, so I've gotten a couple more questions via chat. This is certainly a big picture issue. What would you consider to be the most pressing space policy issue of our time? And what do you anticipate will be the most consequential policy issue 20 to 30 years from now? Mike, let me start with you.
Great. Well, I won't answer the first one because when you're in the situation, no one has objectivity. So depending on where you sit, it's pressing today. But I would like to address the second one, and I have a little bit of bias here, but deep down, this is personal. I think the long-term major policy issue that'll shape generations and generations and generations and generations is the norms that govern outer space. Right? That in the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we as nations will make decisions about what the rules are in outer space. And once a rule is set and it becomes sort of consensus norms, they're usually anchored. It's called a heuristic. So you get a legal or normative cognitive heuristic that anchors a community. And we're in the process of doing that. Once that anchor is set, it takes a lot of energy, a lot of cultural energy, a lot of energy to change that anchor. And so from a historical perspective, in 500 years or 1,000 years, we're likely to see decisions made in my lifetime or my children's lifetime that are still rippling through on what's the right thing to do. How do you approach the rules of outer space, going throughout the solar system or beyond?
Great point. Nathan?
I think one of the most pressing and consequential issues that we'll see in the near term on Mike's timeline of 1,000 years, just in the next 20 to 30 years, will be space sustainability. I know that's an interest of Planet being a good steward on orbit, SIA, and its members being good stewards on orbit. And a lot of the current regulations that are in process and we're discussing, in particular the FCC, Orbital Debris Mitigation Proceeding, is about ensuring a sustainable space environment for everyone. It's selfishly in our own self-interest to maintain a sustainable space environment so that our own satellites can continue operating. But I think one of the great things to see from the community is that they go beyond just their self-interest, and they do, again, want to ensure a sustainable space environment for all operators, all constituents, all people on Earth.
Yeah, Nathan, and as you well know, we've got a working group at SIA focused on space sustainability. We engage continuously with the government, including with the Commerce Department, which is working on an industry day to address some of these issues. Let me ask Henry if he's got anything to add to that, and then I want to turn to what will probably have to be our last question.
So Nathan took my response, but articulated it way better than I did. But I will say that one area that's really I will say is just cool, that's sort of on the radar in the near term, is the space tourism industry. America, in between COVID and everything else that's going on, we were able to follow along 2 astronauts who went up to the International Space Station and came back, and it really captivated everybody and was a sign of hope. And I think the fact that others maybe not will go that high or won't be up in space for that long, but can take a short trip to space in the near term is pretty cool. So that's something that I'm looking forward to.
Great. So the next question relates to cybersecurity. Certainly a very important issue. It comes up continuously. Again, we've got a working group focused on cybersecurity issues for the industry. But the question is, what is your take on cybersecurity policies and regulations for small sats? Mike, let me start with you.
Oh, Tom, I have a world-class CIO who could answer this question in a minute. I am not comfortable addressing this one. I'm sorry.
Yeah, understood. It is a very focused area. Let me ask Nathan, anything that you can comment on?
I promise Mike and I are not coordinating behind the scenes. I think the fact that we're both co-chairs of the same forum means that we both have similar positions and concerns. So I can't comment on that.
Yeah, fair enough. Henry?
I would just say flexible policies going forward that try to match up with international norms and standards. I'm not going to say anything earth-shattering there, but just giving industry the flexibility to meet those cybersecurity concerns.
Okay. We've got about a minute left. We have had over 80 participants. Let me just run through each of our speakers. Anything that you would like to add, words of wisdom as we wrap up the session? I'll start with you, Henry, and then I'll go to Nathan and Mike.
I just want to thank everybody for joining today. And no, I don't have any words of wisdom, but I will say that Michael's thoughts about the next 40 to 1,000 years, I'm going to be thinking about for the rest of the day. So thanks for that. Very interesting.
Great. Thank you. Nathan?
Nothing in particular except good luck to everybody and stay safe.
And Mike?
Well, I want to thank you for the opportunity to be here with this community of practice, and I want to recognize how valuable it is to have this community organize and communicate and share. And I just want to emphasize to everyone that to the extent that you can, please continue to communicate with your political leadership, whether it's your representative, whether it's your local, state officials. Communicate with them about who you are and what you do and why it's important, because together as a community, we bring a lot of value to our country. And I think that the more we can articulate that value and share information to empower decision makers to make informed decisions, the more we're doing a service not only to ourselves, but to our country.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. We engage at SIA, engage with policymakers all of the time, and I continuously get questions about what are some of the most innovative companies, interesting things that you're seeing in the industry, and whether it's funneled through SIA for those of you who are members, or whether you provide it directly to policymakers. They're really interested in what is happening in the industry. So with that, I know that we've reached the end of our session. I want to thank Henry, Nathan, and Mike for joining us. Great session. Really appreciate your time, your contribution to this. And I want to thank all of our participants for taking time out of their day and joining us. I hope that this has been helpful for you. Thank you.